We spend our entire existence trying to escape suffering. We build cities to shield us from the cold. We invent agriculture to banish hunger, and we create laws to silence the chaos of violence. We operate under the assumption that if we could just remove the struggle, if we could just guarantee safety and comfort for every living soul, we would finally be happy. But in 1968, one man decided to test that theory. He built a perfect world. He removed every source of pain, fear, and want, creating a biological heaven on Earth. And within 4 years, it was a graveyard. This is the story of Universe 25, an experiment that proved the apocalypse does not come from fire or war, but from the one thing we all desire most, a perfect life. To understand the magnitude of the catastrophe, we must first inspect the architecture of the paradise that Dr. John B. Calhoun constructed within the sterile confines of the National Institute of Mental Health in Maryland. This was not a standard laboratory cage designed for short-term observation. It was a sprawling, self-contained metropolis, a galvanized steel superstructure measuring nearly 9 feet across and rising over 4 feet into the air. Calhoun designed the enclosure with the meticulous obsession of a city planner who had been given unlimited resources and a mandate to cure every societal ill. The walls were lined with 16 vertical tunnels, welded mesh tubes that allowed the inhabitants to ascend into the upper reaches of the city where 256 nesting boxes awaited them. Each box was spacious, clean, and capable of housing 15 individuals comfortably, meaning the physical infrastructure could theoretically support a population of 3,840 residents without a single instance of overcrowding. The brilliance of the design lay not just in its spatial capacity, but in the absolute eradication of biological scarcity, effectively simulating a post-labor economy where work was rendered obsolete. Food was not something to be foraged, hunted, or fought for. It was delivered endlessly through 16 massive hoppers that were designed to dispense pellets in such quantities that the population could never possibly consume it all. Water flowed freely from automatic dispensers, ensuring that no resident would ever know the sensation of thirst, and the entire environment was kept at a perfectly regulated 68 degrees Fahrenheit. In the wild, a mouse's life is a constant, brutal negotiation with the elements, a frantic race against freezing temperatures, starvation, and predation. In Universe 25, winter never came, the harvest never failed, and the shadows never held the eyes of a hawk or the teeth of a cat. Calhoun had effectively created a pocket dimension where the laws of natural selection were suspended, a bubble of existence where the weak were not culled and the slow were not punished. To ensure the purity of this utopia, the facility was subjected to rigorous sanitary protocols that eliminated the microbial threats that have plagued biological life since the dawn of time. There were no viruses, no bacteria, no parasites. The residents were inoculated, quarantined, and screened to ensure they were the healthiest specimens ever to walk the earth. This was the god of the box, removing the final horseman of the apocalypse, pestilence, from the equation, leaving the inhabitants with literally nothing to die from except the slow, inevitable decay of old age. It was a simulation of immortality, or at least the closest approximation that a biological organism could hope to achieve within a finite lifespan. Into this sterilized Eden, Calhoun introduced the progenitors, 4 breeding pairs of mice chosen for their genetic vitality and physical perfection. These 8 individuals, the Adams and Eves of this steel world, were released into a silence that must have felt deafening compared to the chaotic noise of the natural world. They explored the vast, empty tunnels and the unoccupied nesting boxes, marking their territory in a world that offered zero resistance to their desires. For these first few months, the experiment appeared to be a resounding triumph of social engineering, as the mice acclimated to their surroundings with a predictable, almost mechanical efficiency. They nested, they groomed, and they consumed the unlimited resources with the voracious appetite of creatures who had evolved to hoard against a famine that would never arrive. However, beneath the veneer of this scientific generosity lay a cold, hard calculation that the mice could not perceive. The experiment was never about whether they would survive, but how they would destroy themselves when survival was no longer a challenge. Calhoun was not merely observing rodents. He was interrogating the fundamental structure of social animals, hypothesizing that social organization is a byproduct of necessity. We band together to hunt, to defend, and to build because we are vulnerable alone, but Universe 25 removed the vulnerability, and in doing so, it removed the foundational purpose of society itself. The enclosure was a gilded cage, yes, but it was also a vacuum chamber designed to suck out the meaning of existence, leaving behind only the raw, biological imperative to consume and reproduce. As the first litters were born into this world of plenty, they entered a reality that was fundamentally different from any environment their ancestors had ever known. They were Universe 25 natives, creatures who had never felt the bite of cold wind or the adrenaline of a chase, and whose entire concept of the world was defined by the steel walls and the endless grain. They grew faster and heavier than their wild counterparts, their bodies swelling with the surplus of calories, their coats glossy and perfect in the predator-free air. To the casual observer, it looked like the ultimate success of the welfare state, a triumph of resource distribution where no child went hungry and no parent feared for their offspring's safety. But Calhoun, watching from his observation platform above the fray, knew that he had set a clock ticking, a countdown governed not by resources, but by the finite nature of social space and the fragile wiring of the mammalian brain. The true horror of the experiment was that the god of the box was not malevolent in the traditional sense. He did not torture his subjects with pain, but with the total absence of it. By solving the problem of survival, Calhoun had inadvertently created a pressure cooker for the psyche, a place where the biological machinery of the mouse was left spinning in neutral, generating heat with nowhere to go. The enclosure was designed to handle the physical bodies of nearly 4,000 mice, but it had no capacity to handle the psychological weight of a population that had nothing to do but exist. The stage was set for the boom phase, the era of exponential growth where the population would double every 55 days, filling the silence of the early days with the roar of a society rushing headlong toward a cliff it could not see. The growth phase began with a deceptive sense of prosperity, as the initial 8 inhabitants transitioned into a period of frantic, unchecked reproduction. Every 55 days, the population of Universe 25 doubled with mathematical precision, ballooning from the original 4 pairs to 20, then 100, and eventually surpassing 600 individuals. This was the era of the explosion, a demographic surge that pushed the limits of the social architecture, even as the food hoppers remained overflowing. The sheer velocity of this growth created an environment where the biological reality of the residents could not keep pace with the density of their peers. For a time, the system appeared to absorb the shock, but the foundational cracks were already forming beneath the surface of this thriving metropolis. In the harsh reality of the natural world, death acts as a necessary mechanism for social mobility, clearing the path for younger generations to assume roles of leadership and territory. However, in the sterile bubble of Calhoun-esque creation, the mortality rate was nearly zero, meaning the old guard remained entrenched in their positions of power indefinitely. These dominant males, who had secured the prime nesting boxes during the early days, never vacated their posts to make room for the rising youth. The young males reached maturity only to find that every social niche was already occupied by an elder who showed no signs of weakening or dying. This created a stagnant hierarchy where the natural cycle of succession was broken, leaving an entire generation of healthy, capable animals with no social purpose and no territory to call their own. The removal of the struggle for survival introduced a new, unforeseen toxin into the environment: the burden of excessive free time. In the wild, a mouse must dedicate nearly every waking hour to the search for food, the avoidance of predators, and the maintenance of a nest. In Universe 25, these tasks were automated by the god of the box, leaving the inhabitants with a massive surplus of energy and a complete lack of productive outlets. This led to a state of hyper-socialization, where the residents were forced into a constant, exhausting cycle of interaction with their peers. Without the distractions of survival, the mice began to focus entirely on each other, leading to a psychological overload that the mammalian brain was never evolved to process. The brain, designed for the quiet solitude of the forest floor, was now being bombarded by hundreds of social signals every hour, leading to a total collapse of the animal's internal compass. This sensory saturation triggered a phenomenon that Calhoun termed the behavioral sink, a pathological drive toward togetherness that defied all logic. Despite the fact that dozens of nesting boxes remained entirely empty and peaceful, the mice began to congregate in massive, suffocating heaps within a few select areas. They would crowd into a single feeding station by the hundreds, climbing over one another and engaging in senseless, repetitive movements while ignoring the identical, empty stations just a few feet away. It was as if the capacity for individual choice had been eroded by the density of the crowd, replaced by a mindless, magnetic pull toward the center of the mass. Privacy became a forgotten luxury, and the constant physical friction of the group began to manifest as a low-grade, simmering hostility that permeated the entire enclosure. The most visible victims of this social collapse were the outcasts, a growing class of young males who had been violently rejected by the established groups. Having failed to secure a territory or a mate, these individuals withdrew from the social struggle entirely, congregating in the center of the floor in a listless, scarred mass known as the brood. They were characterized by a total lack of social initiative, spending their days in a state of catatonic withdrawal punctuated only by sudden, explosive bursts of senseless violence. If one member of the brood moved or bumped into another, the entire group would erupt into a frenzy of biting and scratching before sinking back into a collective stupor. They were the first true sign of the rot, a population of biological ghosts who had been denied a role in paradise and were now slowly losing the ability to function as living creatures. Their presence served as a grim warning that the physical health of the body meant nothing if the social structure that gave it meaning had been completely hollowed out. As the population density pressed against the psychological ceiling of the enclosure, the social fabric began to tear at its most critical seam: the role of the dominant male. In a functioning mouse society, the alpha is the gatekeeper of order, a sentinel who patrols the perimeter of his territory to ensure the safety of the nursing females and the vulnerable pups within. But in the chaos of Universe 25, the sheer volume of challengers became a mathematical impossibility for even the most robust males to manage. A dominant male might successfully repel an intruder, but before he could even catch his breath or groom his fur, 3 more challengers would emerge from the teeming mass in the center of the pen. The defense of territory transformed from a manageable duty into a Sisyphean nightmare, a constant, exhausting grinding down of the spirit that eventually broke the will of the defenders. One by one, the kings of the city abdicated their thrones, collapsing into a state of learned helplessness and retreating into the background, leaving the nesting boxes wide open to the anarchy brewing below. This vacuum of power triggered a catastrophic shift in the behavior of the females, who were now left exposed and vulnerable in the nesting boxes. Forced to assume the role of defender that their mates had abandoned, the nursing mothers underwent a radical psychological transformation that was antithetical to the nurturing state required for child rearing. To survive the constant intrusions, they became aggressive, territorial, and hyperviolent, adopting the testosterone fuel behaviors of the males they had replaced. However, A biological organism cannot easily toggle between the mindset of a vicious warrior and a gentle mother. The aggression required to defend the nest bled inextricably into their interactions with their own young. The sanctuary of the nest became a battleground, and the maternal instinct, arguably the most powerful force in the mammalian brain, began to curdle into something unrecognizable. The tragedy that followed was a complete inversion of a natural order, a descent into a behavior pattern that Calhoun cataloged with a grim, clinical fascination. The mothers, agitated by the stress of defense and the overcrowding, began to turn on their own litters with a ferocity that defied biological explanation. Pups that were still dependent on milk were violently ejected from the nesting boxes, thrown out into the dangerous corridors long before they were weaned or capable of fending for themselves. In many documented instances, the stress was so overwhelming that the mothers would simply attack and consume their offspring, erasing their genetic legacy in a frenzy of misplaced aggression. The nest, designed to be the warm heart of the colony, became a slaughterhouse where the first lesson a newborn mouse learned was not warmth, but pain inflicted by the very creature that gave it life. Even when the mothers did not resort to direct violence, their capacity to care for the young shattered under the cognitive load of the environment. Calhoun observed a recurring, heartbreaking phenomenon where mothers would attempt to move their litters from one box to another to escape the noise, only to lose track of what they were doing mid-task. A mother would pick up a pup, carry it halfway across the enclosure, drop it to chase off an intruder or interact with a peer, and then simply forget the pup existed. These abandoned infants were left scattered across the metal floor like discarded trash, crying out for a parent who had already moved on to the next meaningless interaction. They eventually died of exposure or were cannibalized by passing adults, not out of hunger. The food hoppers were still full, but out of a sheer, pathological breakdown of social inhibition. Amidst this collapse of the family unit, a new and terrifying cast of male emerged from the chaos, a group Calhoun dubbed the probers. Unlike the beautiful ones who would come later, or the outcasts who withdrew, the probers were defined by a hyperactive, frantic refusal to adhere to any social boundaries whatsoever. These mice were not interested in territory or traditional dominance. They were agents of pure entropy who moved through the city with a frantic, vibrating energy. They refused to wait for social cues or courtship rituals, instead choosing to chase females relentlessly across the enclosure, ignoring their defensive posturing and forcing interactions through sheer attrition. They were the biological manifestation of a society that had lost its brakes, creatures of pure impulse who recognized no authority and feared no reprisal. The probers violated the one sacred rule of mouse society. They invaded the nesting boxes. In a normal colony, the deep burrows are sanctuaries where males rarely tread, but the probers saw the unguarded tunnels as open hunting grounds. They would swarm up the ladders and burst into the nursing chambers, attacking the females and the young indiscriminately. Their violence was pansexual and cannibalistic. They would mount other males, females, and juveniles alike, and they would feed on the flesh of the living and the dead, despite the unlimited pellets available just a few feet away. This was not predation for survival. It was a deranged consumption born of overstimulation, a way to interact with a world that had become too dense to process. The probers turned the upper levels of the city, the suburbs of Universe 25, into a zone of absolute terror where death could arrive at any moment in the form of a frantic, biting shadow. The inevitable result of this violence was the rise of a lost generation, a cohort of young mice who were raised in the crossfire of maternal aggression and prober invasions. These survivors were not merely physically scarred. They were socially lobotomized, growing up without the crucial imprinting that takes place in a healthy nest. They never learned how to court a mate, how to defend a territory, or how to engage in the complex grooming rituals that bind a colony together. Their only education was fear, and their only social model was the chaotic violence of their parents. As they reached maturity, they were physically adult, but psychologically hollow, possessing the hardware of a mouse, but lacking the software to function as one. They wandered the enclosure as blank slates, unable to connect, unable to breed, and unable to perpetuate the species, signaling the beginning of the end for the colony. The physical bodies were still alive, but the culture of the mouse, the invisible web of rules and behaviors that allows a group to survive, had been totally extinguished. The violence of the probers and the chaotic aggression of the nursing mothers did not last forever, for even anarchy requires energy to sustain itself. Eventually, the screaming, biting frenzy that had defined the peak of Universe 25 began to subside, replaced not by a return to order, but by a heavy, suffocating silence. The population, which had peaked at 2,200 individuals, began to contract as the older generations succumbed to age and the birth rate plummeted toward zero. The enclosure, once a roaring city of constant motion, transformed into a quiet nursing home for the socially dead, a place where the residents moved with the slow, deliberate lethargy of creatures who had nowhere to go and nothing to achieve. The frantic struggle for territory evaporated because no one cared enough to claim it anymore, and the desperate fights for dominance ceased because the concept of hierarchy had been erased from the collective mind of the colony. From the ashes of this societal collapse emerged the final generation of mice, a group that Calhoun hauntedly referred to as the beautiful ones. These individuals were physically perfect, distinguished by their sleek, glossy coats and the total absence of the scars, torn ears, or missing tails that marked the veterans of the earlier violence. They earned their name not through virtue, but through a total, pathological withdrawal from the messy reality of social existence. They survived by disengaging completely, refusing to fight, refusing to court, and refusing to participate in the chaotic rituals that had destroyed their parents. To the casual observer, they looked like the healthiest specimens in the history of the experiment, but their physical perfection was merely the casing for a profound internal emptiness. The daily routine of a beautiful one was a cycle of pure, unadulterated narcissism, stripped of any responsibility to the group or the species. They spent their waking hours engaging in only 3 activities: eating, drinking, and grooming themselves with an obsessive, ritualistic intensity. They would sit for hours smoothing their fur, ensuring every hair was in place, seemingly entranced by their own physical maintenance while remaining utterly indifferent to the world around them. They did not seek mates, they did not build nests, and they did not acknowledge the presence of other mice even when they were standing shoulder to shoulder at the food hoppers. They were biological machines that had been optimized for consumption and self-preservation, but in the process, they had discarded the complex web of instincts that makes a mouse a mouse. This behavioral sink extended to the females as well, who mirrored the male withdrawal by shutting down their reproductive systems entirely. The ovaries of the female shrank, and their hormonal cycles ceased, a biological response to the lack of appropriate social triggers in their environment. Without the complex courtship dances or the territorial security provided by a dominant male, the females simply stopped regarding themselves as potential mothers. The birth rate, which had once doubled the population every 2 months, flatlined completely, marking the moment when the colony committed unintentional suicide. There were no new litters to replace the dying, no squeaking pups to signal the future. There was only the aging population of the beautiful ones, growing older and fatter in their sterile, silent paradise. The most terrifying discovery of the experiment came when the population began to die off, opening up vast amounts of space and resources once again. Logic would dictate that with the overcrowding resolved and the stress removed, the survivors would return to normal behaviors, reclaiming the empty nesting boxes and restarting the cycle of life. But the damage to the beautiful ones was terminal. They had missed the critical window of social learning in their youth, and no amount of open space could teach them what they had never learned. They remained trapped in their infantile, narcissistic state, wandering through the empty halls of a ghost city, unable to recognize the opportunity for renewal that lay before them. They were genetically capable of breeding, but psychologically sterile, proof that social behavior is not a guaranteed instinct, but a fragile skill that can be lost forever if the environment fails to support it. Calhoun described this phenomenon as the first death, a spiritual extinction that inevitably precedes the physical death of the body. He argued that an animal is defined by its struggles, by the complex interplay of courtship, defense, and purpose that drives it to interact with its kin. When those behaviors are stripped away by a life of total ease and social chaos, the animal dies in spirit, leaving behind a hollow organic husk that continues to breathe and eat, but has ceased to live in any meaningful sense. The beautiful ones were the walking dead, creatures that had been hollowed out by the very utopia that was designed to save them. They existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the clock to run out on their biological functions, unaware that they were the last of their kind. The end came with a slow, grinding inevitability, a long fade to black that lacked even the dignity of a final struggle. In May of 1973, for years after the first optimistic pairs were introduced to the enclosure, the last resident of Universe 25 breathed its final breath. The experiment had not ended in a bang, nor in a fire, but in total, absolute extinction amidst a surplus of food and water. The god of the box had provided everything necessary for life except the struggle that gives life meaning. And in doing so, he had proven that paradise is not a garden, but a grave. The steel walls of the enclosure stood silent, guarding a pile of bones and a terrifying dataset that suggested the path to extinction is paved with comfort. It is comforting to retreat into the defense that we are not mice, that the complex architecture of the human mind exempts us from the fate of simple rodents. We tell ourselves that we possess art, philosophy, and the capacity for reason, tools that surely elevate us above the biological determinism of a creature driven solely by instinct. However, this arrogance ignores the uncomfortable truth that the machinery driving our social behaviors, the limbic system, the drive for status, the need for connection, is largely identical to the hardware found in Calhoun's subjects. We are biological organisms subject to the same laws of density and purpose, and when you strip away the technological distractions of our modern age, the parallels between Universe 25 and our current trajectory become impossible to ignore. The mouse does not need poetry to feel the crushing weight of purposelessness, and neither do we. The collapse of the spirit requires only the removal of the struggle that defines it. If you look closely at the most advanced, comfortable societies on our planet, you will see the shadows of the beautiful ones and the outcasts walking among us. In Japan, the phenomenon of the hikikomori has seen nearly 1 million young men withdraw entirely from society, locking themselves in their bedrooms for years, refusing to work, date, or engage with a world they find overwhelming. In the West, we see the rise of the NET demographic and the herbivore men, individuals who have voluntarily abdicated the roles of courtship and competition, choosing instead a life of solitary, low-stress existence. These are not merely economic statistics. They are the human equivalent of the mice who retreated to the center of the pen, overwhelmed by the social noise and opting for a form of social suicide. We are witnessing a generation that has looked at the intense competition of the modern enclosure and decided that the only winning move is not to play, mirroring the exact behavioral sink that preceded the extinction of Calhoun as colony. Furthermore, the obsession with the self that defined the final generation of mice is mirrored with terrifying clarity in our digital age. The beautiful ones spent their days grooming their fur, obsessed with their physical appearance while remaining utterly indifferent to the survival of their species. Today, we curate our digital avatars with pathological precision, obsessing over fitness, filters, and the projection of a flawless life, while our actual capacity for deep, messy, human connection atrophies. We have built a culture of narcissism, where the individual is the sun around which the universe revolves, yet we report higher rates of loneliness and depression than any generation in history. Simultaneously, the birth rates in the most developed, utopian nations, South Korea, Japan, much of Europe, have plummeted below replacement levels, not because of famine or war, but because, like the mice, we have simply lost the instinctual drive to perpetuate ourselves. The most dangerous misconception about Universe 25 is that it was a warning about overpopulation, a fear that we would simply run out of space and resources. But Calhoun's data showed something far more disturbing. The colony destroyed itself long before it reached its physical capacity, and the food hoppers remained full until the very end. The danger was not scarcity. The danger was the total elimination of struggle, the creation of a world where life was so easy that it became meaningless. When we automate every chore, cure every disease, and soothe every anxiety with a pill or a screen, we're not liberating ourselves. We are cutting the strings that hold our psychological marionette together. We are engineering a human version of the God of the Box, a technocratic system designed to maximize safety and comfort at the expense of the friction that makes us feel alive. We must confront the possibility that the apocalypse will not arrive in the form of a nuclear mushroom cloud or a catastrophic asteroid impact, but as a quiet, comfortable fade into nothingness. It will look like a clean, temperature-controlled room where a healthy, well-fed human sits alone, staring at a screen, feeling absolutely no desire to stand up. The tragedy of Universe 25 is not that the mice died, but that they forgot how to live long before their hearts stopped beating. We are currently building the walls of our own paradise, brick by brick, and we should be terrified that we might actually succeed in finishing it. The experiment is no longer confined to a galvanized steel box in Maryland. It has expanded to encompass the entire world, and we're the subjects waiting to see if we can survive the perfection we so desperately crave.